Here's the main problem with this. The main problem is that Putin does not want to negotiate. I have always replied this to the what I call the axis of appeasement, which again the aforementioned Nathan Robinsons and Ben Burgesses and Branko Marchettis's of this world of the online left sphere, among others. Whenever they post their bullshit, I reply to them and I ask them two very simple questions. One, how do you get Putin to the negotiating table? Two, what makes anything that Putin signs on that negotiating table remotely believable, given that he has basically violated every treaty that he has ever signed or that Russia has ever signed involving Ukraine? Until you can answer me those two questions, I think the correct course of action is to continue doing what the West has been doing now, which is to arm Ukraine, support it in every material and non-material way so that they can win the war on the battlefield. When these geniuses find a way to answer those two questions, then we can discuss negotiations.
When the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
The Progressive Caucus in the US Congress has recently published a letter that basically calls for, I would say, a discussion of what the conditions are for the US to push for peace in Ukraine. And, well, I have to say, this is a very poorly timed letter, very poorly written letter, and I think it is completely counterproductive to the end game of peace in Ukraine. Not just peace in Ukraine, but a peace that is favorable to Ukraine, which really is the important part. I mean, we could have peace tomorrow if Ukraine essentially surrenders and decides to give up the territory that Russia currently occupies. I'm pretty sure we could have peace tomorrow. That is not the kind of peace that I think is acceptable to Ukrainian people, not acceptable to the world as a whole, because it essentially legitimizes the imperial ambitions of Russia and basically just sends a letter that they can keep doing it to whoever they want. And not just Russia, but China and the US as well. So I don't think that that is acceptable. And I do think my position, I think for those of you who follow me on Twitter, know that it's very clear. I support Ukraine 100%, like unconditional, with certain caveats on escalation. So maybe not 100%, maybe 99%. There are issues on escalation. There are issues of potential nuclear war risks that I do think we have to intelligently discuss. But to be fair, I think what has been going on now, the existing levels of support that the West has been giving to Ukraine, I think that is perfectly fine. And I think this needs to continue until the war is over, given that right now there is a legitimate belief that Ukraine can win this war. And by win, I mean drive the Russians out, at least from the Donbass and the areas that it's occupied since the war began. Crimea is a slightly different and I would say trickier issue. And I'm not going to discuss this. Maybe I'll make another video on this later. But in the meantime, I think that is the objective. Get the Russians out, back to not just to the February 24 or 23rd position, but also the land in the Donbass that is controlled by the separatists who have been funded and armed by Russia. I think that is the minimum. Anyway, let's read this letter and see what is so wrong about it. Dear Mr. President, we write with your appreciation for your commitment to Ukraine's legitimate struggle against Russia's war of aggression. Your support for self-defense of, yada, 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 yada. Skip this one. Critically, you achieve this while also maintaining that it's imperative to avoid direct conflict with Russia, which would lead to World War III, something we must strive to prevent. I think the US has been very, very, very cautious of trying not to get involved directly. And if it had wanted to, it would have already done it. It would already have found an excuse to do it. It hasn't done it. I think anyone who still believes that the US wants to get involved in an actual shooting war with Russia is an idiot. The risk of nuclear weapons being used has been estimated to be higher now than any time since the height of the Cold War. Yeah, who has threatened this? Russia, not the West. Given the catastrophic possibilities of nuclear escalation, again, who is making the nuclear threats? Russia. Be clear about who is making those threats, because the way this is phrased is very vague. It's basically like both sides are doing brinkmanship when the West has not threatened Russia in any way with nukes. Nuclear escalation and miscalculation, which only increases the longer this war continues. We agree with your goal of avoiding direct military conflict as an overriding national security priority. Given the destruction created by this war for Ukraine and the world, as well as the risk of catastrophic escalation, we also believe it's the interest of Ukraine, the US, and the world to avoid a prolonged conflict. Yeah, by increasing the arms transfer so Ukraine can win quicker. That's really it for me. For this reason, we urge you to pair the military and economic support for the United States has provided Ukraine with proactive diplomatic push, redoubling efforts to seek a realistic framework for a ceasefire. This is consistent with your recognition that there's going to have to be a negotiated settlement here, and you're concerned that Vladimir Putin doesn't have a way out right now, and I'm trying to figure out what we do about that. Okay, so Putin's way out is to leave Ukraine. Okay, full stop. This war is not a threat to Russian sovereignty. It's not a threat to their existence as a nation. So the idea that Russia doesn't have an exit option is BS, complete BS. They have the option. They can leave Ukraine, take the L, which by now is obvious because they cannot win. They cannot win by anything approximating their original military goals. Yeah, now the first question that I would ask, well, let me read the next paragraph. We are under no illusions regarding the difficulties involving in engaging Russia given its outrageous and illegal invasion of Ukraine, its decision to make additional illegal annexations of Ukrainian territory. Yeah, who is making peace less likely? Is it the West by not wanting to engage with Putin? Or is it Putin basically raising the stakes of what he's going to demand on the table? Because now that those regions have been annexed by Russia, it's going to look less good for him if he has to eventually withdraw from them. So it's not that we're not giving Putin exit strategies, is that he is basically blocking his own ability to create exit strategies. Because if he wanted that exit strategy, he would not have annexed those regions, because now that makes his exit strategy more humiliating. So, gotta be clear about this. Who is complicating this process? Putin is, not the West. However, if there is a way to end the war while preserving a free and independent Ukraine, I'm sorry, this is not the baseline. Like, you can have a free and independent Ukraine that is 20% smaller than it is now because it gave up all this territory. That's not acceptable to Ukraine. Putin still wins in this scenario. His gamble won. He won this gamble. He can do this again next time, whether it's going to be Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan or Armenia or any other neighboring country that he has, Belarus if it decides to turn Western. If something like the 2014 protests in Ukraine happen in Belarus, do you think he's not going to do the same? Of course he will. Of course he will. Yeah, it is America's responsibility to pursue every diplomatic avenue to support such a solution that is acceptable to the people of Ukraine. Okay, so as it is, none of this is acceptable to the people of Ukraine, the majority of which want to kick the Russians out. Such a framework would presumably include incentives to end hostilities, including some form of sanctions relief, and bring together the international community to establish security guarantees for a free and independent Ukraine that are acceptable for all parties, particularly Ukrainians. Security guarantees, I don't know, like the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which Russia signed along with the US and the UK to guarantee Ukrainian sovereign to uphold the borders, the post breakup borders. Neither of the three countries And I mean, Russia clearly violated the memorandum first and foremost. But what security guarantees does Ukraine have if like the U.S. and Britain did not uh, jump in to defend them in 2014? You know, they basically accepted the status quo after Russia took Crimea and invaded the Donbass. So, I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a Ukrainian. Like, why should I trust any agreement that we cannot enforce? And by we, I mean the Ukrainians. Like, any treaty that can be signed with Putin or any Russian government has to be able to be enforced by Ukraine. And the only way they can enforce it is by a military victory and, you know, after the war, maintaining a strong military, a strong enough military that Russia does not dare attack it again. That is the only way that they're going to guarantee whatever is signed. So let's not imagine that this is going to end in a wishy-washy peace treaty while Russia still has some coercive power over Ukraine. That's not going to happen. The alternative to diplomacy is a protracted war with both its attendant certainties and catastrophic and unknowable risk. Well, we're heading in that direction. I mean, that is a fact. Deal with it. Again, the only way that you can make this war shorter is by arming Ukraine and allowing it to keep fighting and allowing it to keep winning. That is the only way that you will shorten this war, not by any wishy-washy peace treaty that could end up in another war in 5-10 years' time. Russia's invasion has caused incalculable harm for the people of Ukraine. So I hate it when they mention, like when you read this, it just sounds so unempathetic to the people of Ukraine, that like mentioning, we really care about that. This is like, we want peace because poor Ukrainians is such a, like, I see it from every goddamn tanky on Twitter. And just like anti-war, anti-imperialist leftists, they all say that. They don't care about Ukraine. All these people on the prominent Western leftists that have basically taken a kind of subtle Putinite stand, and I'm talking about the Nathan Robinsons, the Ben Burgesses, to say nothing of the Branko Marchetti, who is basically just 1 degree away from being like full-on Team Z. All these people have shown zero empathy for Ukraine throughout the start of the war. Zero. Check on Twitter how many times Ben Burgess has mentioned Bucha or Bucha or Izium or any of the war crimes. They don't. They don't. Everything they tweet about regarding the war is something involving Western escalation, nuclear war, yada, yada, yada. There's no empathy for the Ukrainian people from a significant portion of the Western left. And that is absolutely repulsive. Thousands of civilian soldiers, displacement of 13 million people, while Russia's recent seizures of cities in Ukraine east led to the most pivotal moment in the conflict and the consolidation of Russian control over 20% of Ukraine's territory. Conflict threatens additional tens of millions more worldwide, as skyrocketing prices of wheat, fertilizer, and fuel spark acute crisis in global hunger and poverty, which haven't happened, by the way. I mean, this was the doomsday scenario that a lot of people were predicting back in April, and it hasn't happened. So a war that is allowed to grind on for years, potentially escalating in intensity and geographic scope, threatens to displace, kill, and immiserate far more Ukrainians while causing... Again, I hate it when they're basically calling for Ukraine to surrender and then acting like they care about the Ukrainian people. This is so fucking disgusting. I hate it. While causing blah, blah, blah. Conflict has also contributed to elevated gas and food prices at home. This is really why they're writing this letter. To some extent, I can't blame them for thinking of their constituents first, but this is really what they care about. They don't want to lose an election because of inflation. That's it. That's the reason for this letter. They know that the premium, the electoral premium that they got from the Republicans going, the Supreme Court rulings a couple of months ago on abortion, etc., like that is sort of fading away. And they're just a few weeks right before the midterms worrying about inflation. So they have to appear like they're doing something about this. Economists believe that if the situation in I love like a letter by leftists starting with economists believe, yeah, that if the situation in Ukraine is stabilized, some of the speculative concerns driving higher fuel costs will subside and likely lead to a drop in world oil prices. So speculative. So it's not really a supply and demand issue, is it? Yeah. By the way, prices of natural gas in Europe apparently went to zero yesterday or 2 days ago. I think maybe even negative, because there's an overabundance of supply, and there was this recent news that there's going to be a heat wave in Europe over the next couple of weeks. So anyway. We agree with the administration's perspective that it is not America's place to pressure Ukraine's government regarding sovereign decisions, and with the principle you have enunciated, there should be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. But as legislators responsible for the expenditure of tens of billions of US taxpayer dollars in military assistance, we believe such involvement in this war also creates a responsibility for the US to seriously explore all possible avenues, including direct engagement with Russia, to reduce harm and support Ukraine in achieving a peaceful settlement. Again, for the love of fucking God, it's not that Ukraine doesn't want peace. It's that they don't want a peace that involves them losing that 20% of their territory, because that is a loss to them. They lost the war. It doesn't matter how many battlefield victories they will achieve. If they end up signing a peace agreement and losing 20% of their territory, they lost. This is like World War I. If the armistice had happened in World War I with the German army having its butt kicked, but the conditions of that peace were that Germany took the lands at the level of the front, guess what? A significant part of France would end up being German, as would most of Belgium as well. So this idea that we just want peace, but we're not going to set the conditions of the Russian army leaving Ukraine and giving back those territories, that's not a peace. That's not how Ukraine will see it as a win. In May, President Zelensky, despite deadlocked negotiations, reiterated that the war will only... They spelled Zelensky with like the Russian spelling, which is weird, isn't it? Reiterated that the war will only definitively end through diplomacy. All wars eventually end up with diplomacy. The Japanese signed a peace treaty through diplomacy on a US battleship in 1945 after 2 of their cities got nuked. That is not diplomacy. It's basically surrender. So understand that, this idea that all wars end in negotiation, or they all end in diplomacy, as Chomsky has been saying recently. But you have to set the tone of what those negotiations will be like. You set the conditions. What we want is basically for the moment that Ukraine and Russia sit down on that table, Ukraine has most of the cards. That's really the end game, if you ask me. In conclusion, we urge you to make vigorous diplomatic efforts in support of a negotiated settlement and ceasefire, engage in direct talks with Russia, explore prospects for a new European security arrangement acceptable to all parties that will allow for a sovereign, independent Ukraine, and in coordination with our Ukrainian partners, seek a rapid end to the conflict and reiterate this goal as America's chief priority. So, interesting what they mean by new European security arrangement. That allows for a sovereign and independent Ukraine, because if a sovereign independent Ukraine wants to join the EU or wants to join NATO, will that be acceptable? I wonder what they think. Anyway, here's the main problem with this. The main problem is that Putin does not want to negotiate. I have always replied this to what I call the axis of appeasement, which, again, the aforementioned Nathan Robinsons and Ben Burgesses and Branko Marchettishes of this world, of the online left sphere, among others, whenever they post their bullshit, I reply to them and I ask them 2 very simple questions. 1, how do you get Putin to the negotiating table? 2, what makes anything that Putin signs on that negotiating table remotely believable, given that he has basically violated every treaty that he has ever signed or that Russia has ever signed involving Ukraine? Until you can answer me those 2 questions, I think the correct course of action is to continue doing what the West has been doing now, which is to arm Ukraine, support it in every material and non-material way so that they can win the war on the battlefield. When these geniuses find a way to answer those 2 questions, then we can discuss negotiations. And I'm not saying this facetiously. I am not saying this, without the knowledge that Russia doesn't want to negotiate. In fact, here is the latest and greatest from... Oh, this is... I believe I got the tweet wrong. Anyway, there was a reporting from no less than the TASS, which is the Russian news agency. And what's stunning about this is that they basically admit that Putin does not want to negotiate in any way. So let me find it here, because there we go. Here's the link. Putin sees no need for talks with Biden for now. This is TASS, the Russian news agency. The Russian president stressed that at the moment no direct talks with any of the leaders of other states participating in the G20 summit were on the agenda. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that he sees no need at the moment for talks with US President Joe Biden. He should be asked whether he is ready to hold such negotiations with me or not. To be honest, I don't see any need by and large. There's no platform for any negotiations for the time being, Putin told the media on Friday when asked about the possibility of a meeting with Biden at the G20 summit in Indonesia. We maintain permanent contact with some of them, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. Look at the date, 14 October. So basically just a few days before today. I don't think his position has changed. And if anything, I think this letter is going to make it less likely that he's going to negotiate, and allow me to explain why. This was a very good tweet. Very good threat from a guy called Dante Atkins. And when I read this tweet, it was like, yep, you basically nailed it. I usually agree with the members of the Progressive Caucus signed the letter to Biden on Ukraine, but this letter is worse than useless. It will have the opposite of its intended effect. Here's why. Far from shortening the war, I view it as a certainty that this letter will make its way to Russian state media within the next day or two as evidence of fracturing solidarity among politicians in Biden's own party for his support of Ukraine. It will further encourage Putin that his long-term strategy of keeping the war going until U.S. domestic resolve breaks or a Putin-friendly politician wins the presidency is viable, and Russian propaganda media will work overtime to convince the public that it is viable. To further this fracturing, Russia will attempt to continue to disrupt global energy supplies and Ukrainian food exports because the Progressive Caucus just told Putin that these things were creating domestic pressure in the U.S. You basically showed your hand, you dumbasses. The letter just told Putin and Lavrov that their strategy is working. They now have an incentive to conduct further atrocities in Ukraine, do even more damage to global supply chains, and keep the war machine going as long as they can. Progressive Caucus members thought they were trying to shorten the war, but if anything, they just prolonged it. It was baffling, severe foreign policy blunder that risked long-term consequences. And yeah, I think that animated gif of Captain Kirk slapping himself pretty much sums up what happened. And let's be clear about this. This is the only way that Russia can win the war. If it sufficiently causes the West to waver on its support for Ukraine, to the point that Ukraine's offensive capability gets eroded, and they basically just end up in a frozen conflict. It becomes the Donbass war all over again, where the front just barely moves for years on end, at a much higher intensity and a much higher casualty count, which ultimately Russia, given its infinite number of unlimited amount of manpower and equipment, is in a better position to do that than Ukraine. So they can keep the war going for another year, another 2 years, quite easily, and just wait until Ukraine tires out. Wait until the West tires out. Once Ukraine does go to the negotiating table and accepts to give Russia, say, those four annexed regions, that's it. Russia won. They have the patience for it. Putin has the patience for it. He doesn't care about his own people dying. He can mobilize more waves of men, even if they're just poorly trained, half drunk all the time. All they need is to hold the line. All they need is for Ukraine to just not push further. And if, the biggest risk to this is if the Republican Party wins the midterms. This is the biggest risk for that to happen, because then they will start blocking any attempt to continue the current policy. So I want to emphasize that this isn't just an issue of the left. This is an issue that the far right has always had sympathies for Putin. And the far right is far more likely to be in power, both in the US as well as in countries in Europe. So they are the biggest risk for this ending of material support. But the leftists aren't helping in any way, as this letter shows. And yeah, I think by now I've made the case on why this was a stupid letter, absolutely, terrible foreign policy blunder. And I think, any concerns about this, I think should have been raised in private. I think the representative of the Progressive Caucus should have spoken to Biden privately, expressing these concerns, and had a conversation with him, obtained perhaps some assurances. And I want to go further, because myself, like I guess most English-speaking leftists who follow numerous YouTube shows, I'm a big fan of the Majority Report. I think Sam Seder is probably the best guy in the business as far as leftist podcasts or leftist YouTube shows. I tend to usually agree with him. I'm probably more to the left of him on economics, but I think he's as close to a voice of reason as there is on the online left. And I think he has mostly had a genuinely positive take on the Ukraine war, unlike some of his co-hosts, which I will not name, but certainly one of them in particular, who I have seen on Twitter basically like and share some of the BS that Ben Burgess and Branko Marcetic post or tweet all the time. But I think Sam has been quite open and quite vocal on his view that this is definitely an unprovoked imperialist war, and that the US should support Ukraine, but with a lot of caveats. And there was a conversation that he had with with Ronald Reagan, one of the frequent callers to the show, where I think he really needs to sit down. I think he really needs to kind of listen to that conversation again and understand that there's a very, very problematic optics problem. And I'm going to just show a clip of this. This is after the debate, but I think this nails what the problem is. And like I say this with the utmost respect that I have for Sam Seder. I love his show. He is great. I rarely disagree with him. But on this issue, I think he's not on the right side of history here.
There's no doubt in my mind that the invasion of Ukraine is an imperialist project by Russia. Do I think that the expansion of NATO was problematic? I did, completely divorced from this issue, frankly. But do I think it was provocative? It could have been mildly provocative, but do I think it in any way was the provocation rose to the level of having Russia invade Ukraine? No. Do I think that's the primary reason why Putin invaded Ukraine? No. I think he has imperialistic ambitions. And I think this
land
is
for material reasons.
Yes.
So up to this point, I agree 100%. I think Sam is in the minority of leftists, because the campus pro-Putin side of the left, I think, is the dominant one at this point, at least from what you see on on Twitter, and it's very unfortunate.
But all of that is like, that's covered. That's covered. When I survey
Well, it's absolutely not covered on the left. Like, absolutely not. I mean, you will not go to Jacobin, and you will not go to Current Affairs, and find any single piece that is just dwelling on Russian imperialism. Not a single one. It's all basically yes, Putin is a warmonger, but here's 2,000 words on why NATO provoked this by Branko Marcetic. Or here's 2,000 words on why whataboutism isn't bad by Ben Burgess. Logic Lord Ben Burgess. That is all you see on the left. So actually, I would say someone who has the views that Sam just said being the minority views in the online left sphere. Actually, I think it's incredibly important that he does talk about it more than he does.
Expanse of what is being discussed about this conflict, those boxes are checked.
They're not.
What I don't see is any debate whatsoever, or even just analysis, or even like consciousness that we are funding this. And, you know, we see the numbers that are presented to us publicly.
I think everyone's pretty aware that they're funding this. I mean, no one's under the illusion that they're not.
I can assure you that every number that we see publicly, you can times it by 0.5, by 1, and that's the number of that's the money that's going out through other channels that we don't see. Whether it's covert operations, whether it's other, I mean, and I think that it merits a conversation as to like how far are we willing to go. I'm not calling for the end of it, but I am saying like the only thing I can say that it's analogous to.
So this is basically the summary of his position in this debate, that he wants a clear discussion of what the end game is. And this is problematic for two reasons. First one is, wars rarely have a clear end game. And I'll explain to you why. The end game right now, from what we've seen on the battlefield, is clearly that we want a Ukrainian victory and that it's achievable. I definitely do think it's achievable. So what is the end game? The end game to me in this context would be to continue arming Ukraine until they drive the Russians out, back, to the 1991 borders of Ukraine, caveat Crimea under discussion. Like I said, I have some issues with Crimea. That to me is a clear end game. I think that is the Ukrainian end game. I think that's what Zelensky wants. And I think deep inside that is what the US defense establishment wants. So we can be clear that that is the prospective end game. But that isn't necessarily the one that's going to be achievable. So what if in winter it becomes another, months-long slog, months-long artillery duel like the Donbass offensive during the summer, high levels of Ukrainian casualties, barely move, basically World War I conditions for a number of months. And by the time conditions are available for offensive operations, both sides are just, like wary boxers in round 12. And none of them can basically do much. Russia can't recover any of its lost ground. Ukraine can't recover any more of its territory. In this sense, when it becomes obvious that no military victory is achievable, then the conditions have to change. Then the end game has to be different. Then maybe Ukraine should consider giving away some of its territory, because it's obvious that there's no military way in which it's going to recover them. So now the end game has changed. And now the US could be in a position to basically tell Ukraine, look, we're not going to fund this war for 5 years. We're not going to fund it for 10 years. There's just no way you can win anymore. So negotiate something, sacrifice something, and let's get it over with. And we will, continue supporting you so that Russia doesn't invade you again, but this war has to end now. But that end game will only happen if we realize that militarily it's impossible to win. So what Sam is demanding we do now is to have a crystal ball of knowing how the war is gonna evolve on the battlefield for the next couple of months, if not the next year. I do think this war is gonna last at least until next summer. But we don't know that. And what I think is a double standard here is that he's demanding this very clear endgame. It needs to be penciled in. It needs to be in writing. But at the same time, he's never clear on what the prospects for peace are. Again, the two questions that I posed at the beginning of the video. How do you get Putin to negotiate? How do you trust anything that Putin writes in a piece of paper or signs in a piece of paper is worth the very paper that it's signed on? The moment that he can answer those two questions, then we can talk about the end game. But he's being particularly vague on what, how we can get to a point of peace while demanding a very strict definition of what an endgame should be. So I think that's a double standard. You're expecting something from the other side that you're not willing to concede on your own. And like I said, I do think I don't think he's arguing from a dishonest position, because he's been very clear that he is in support of Ukraine and he is in support of arming Ukraine. But I sort of understand, okay, well, we're not going to talk about the things that other, I would say perhaps the mainstream media is talking about. I'm gonna cover this different angle, which is more relevant to leftist discussions. True. But there is no leftist channel that is supporting Ukraine. Like none of them. And that's why I think okay, maybe a couple of streamers are pro-Ukraine, from what I've seen. Vosh, Dylan Burns, that's it. Everyone else is a campist or a Chomskyite in some way or another. So you're just not getting this message across from the leftist ecosystem at all. And I would think it would be incredibly important if a show like The Majority Report was very vocal about this. And you can make the leftist case for supporting Ukraine. And it's very obvious. Like, dude, I know most leftists are uncomfortable at, shelling billions and billions of dollars into the military industrial complex, of fostering, Western intervention abroad. But this is the lesser evil. And I'm not quite sure why this is hard to understand. I do think that the left has a very, very serious issue in conceptualizing lesser evils, especially on foreign policy. In foreign policy, I say this as someone who has I've always hated the anti-war, anti-imperialist left. Always. Since the Iraq War. Because they've been full of shit since. And I say it because I see it in the language. I see it in the rhetoric. I see how they will bend over backwards to defend every authoritarian state on the planet, whitewash every human rights abuse on the planet, as long as it's not done by a Western country. And these people have won. Their voice is the strongest on the left now. And I just find it intolerable that a lot of these channels who have spent the last 4 or 5 years or more basically educating their viewers on why certain leftists aren't really leftists, the Jimmy Dores, the Glenn Greenwalds, etc. Don't do the same to this side of the left, the anti-war side of the left, which is like fully on board with global authoritarianism. I don't get it. And I think that is the optics problem. And I think we're doing a severe, like in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, the left is unelectable for a generation or two. Because all these Ukrainian accounts on Twitter are listening to all the bullshit that, the Western leftists are writing about. And this is like, we've lost all credibility. I know I tweeted this at some point early in the war, or said it in a video. The big risk is the optics. The big risk is that we as leftists lose credibility on foreign policy, which, to be fair, I think we never had. Like I said, because the anti-war left is so full of shit. And we only had it because of the low-hanging fruit, that it was easy to criticize the US during the Iraq War, over things like Guantanamo, over the war on terror going on forever. Yeah, that's the low-hanging fruit. But what happens when it's not the US that's the aggressor? And their brains just fizzle when that's the case. So I seriously beg Sam Cedar, not going to see this video, obviously, to make a bit of an effort to understand the problem of optics here. To the people of the Progressive Caucus, who this letter will lead to Ukrainians dying, because it will prolong the war, because it gives some reassurance that Putin's grander strategy, or rather grander secondary strategy of how he cannot lose this war, is justified in some way. And if he prolongs this war for another month or 2 or 3, longer than he would have, just because he is sure that the West is not united, those are Ukrainian people dying. That letter killed Ukrainians. So, guys, just please, please don't embarrass the leftist movement more than it already has been, because we have lost it on foreign policy completely. No one is going to take the left seriously on foreign policy for a generation after this war, at least. Anyway, and it's heartbreaking. It really is. So, on that rather depressing note, if you like this video, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe to the channel. Apologies for the mic issue on the previous video. Didn't check the video before uploading it, and I bought a new mic. And I clearly didn't have the settings right. So, sorry about that. I hope this one comes out better. And yeah, see you next time.